Mr Luke Charters to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the impact of financial fraud and economic crime. It's an honour to have you, the Chair, Ms Baz, and I thank the House for allowing me to secure this debate today. I also welcome the Minister to their place and thank you also to the Shadow Minister and to the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for attending. I must start by declaring an interest. In my previous role before entering this place, I was Head of Fraud and Compliance for a fintech, responsible for screening billions of dollars of transactions a year. When it comes to dealing with financial criminals, unfortunately, I've seen it all. From the use of artificial intelligence avatars to bypass biometric screening, sophisticated shell companies, complex layering, spear phishing to parasitically take over companies, to advanced cloning techniques of firms, I cannot overemphasise the danger that fraud and economic crime poses, or the now complex layers that exist behind it. And fraud, if I may say so, is an emotional burden on victims. It ruins lives. We'll all know this as MPs from our surgeries, and I'll touch on a case I recently had in one of mine. The criminal aspect of fraud is not just hobbyists in basements. We're increasingly talking about nation-states, in some cases actors who are deeply sophisticated or advanced organised taking the mantle.
Order. Could I just ask everybody sitting in the front row, apparently there's an acoustic problem, so if they could actually move to the back, because the mics aren't working. Thank you very much.
Shall I just test that? May I continue, Mr. Chair? Yes, okay. We're increasingly talking about nation-states, in some cases who are deeply sophisticated, or advanced organised crime groups taking the mantle. They're experienced professionals.
I'm really sorry. Hansard, who may not have picked up the earlier part of your speech. So could I ask you to start again, please? Thank you very much. You're doing a grand job for your first attempt.
With apologies to honourable and right honourable members for hearing the sim, I will start again then with the permission of the Chair. Right. I beg to move that this House has considered the impact of financial fraud and economic crime. It is an honour to have you in the chair, Ms Vaz, and I thank the House for allowing me to secure this debate today. I also welcome the Minister and thank both the Shadow Minister and Lib Dem spokesperson for attending this debate. I must start by declaring an interest. In my previous role before entering this place, I was Head of Fraud and Compliance for a fintech, responsible for screening billions of dollars of transactions a year. When it comes to dealing with financial criminals, unfortunately, I've seen it all. From the use of AI avatars to bypass biometric screening, sophisticated shell companies, complex layering, even to spear phishing and parasitically targeting legitimate companies to advanced cloning techniques, I cannot overemphasise the danger that fraud now poses and financial crime, or the complex layers that exist behind it. And we know that fraud takes an emotional burden on victims. It ruins lives. We know this as MPs from our own surgeries, and I'll touch on a case I heard recently. The criminal aspects of fraud, though, it's not just about hobbyists in basements. We are increasingly talking about nation-states, in some cases, who are working alongside advanced organised crime groups, and they're taking the mantle. There are often experienced professionals who work to circumvent the very systems we use. Criminals are smart and frequently shift their modus operandi to get around our systems. While it falls on the responsibility of government and firms to be smarter and take that proverbial step ahead, it's more complex. The risks are real, and if scams continue to increase exponentially, we'll have a dangerous environment for businesses. We'll have more constituents telling more stories about how they've fallen victim to fraud. And the national cost could become so undesirable that we may well become the worst developed country globally per capita when it comes to fraud rates. If we do not act, there's a risk fraud and economic crime could suffocate growth. Now, we currently suffer from relatively weak national coordination in tackling fraud and economic crime, in my view. It's made more complex by the fact that the perpetrator is often not in the same geographic location as the victim. This can cause local police forces to deprioritise fraud reports. But if we can fix that, we may be able to fix the foundations. Now, while the online fraud charter introduced by the last government was a positive step, it was non-statutory and was voluntary. Nothing in the charter addresses the issue of compensating consumers who have been defrauded by content originating online. There are no penalties for non-compliance, and this has got to be thought through. But we can turn the page. And now, while this government is in its early stages, I believe it's time to smell the coffee, grasp the nettle, whichever analogy you prefer, so we can become a world leader in anti-fraud, in protecting consumers and businesses. We become a country where companies want to do business, and it's a country where businesses will not be ripped off. The prize is that our fintech, regtech and financial services sector will want to become ever more internationally competitive if we truly get to the heart of fraud and economic crime. Now, before I go any further on how we can make some fixes, I just want to quantify the challenges we face. Now, fraud accounts for over 40% of crime in the UK, but only receives 1% of police resources. Now, that statistic is chilling, but wait until you hear the cost. The cost of payments fraud to the UK economy is roughly £1.2 billion. It's also the cost to individuals. And now, I recently had a constituent that attended an advice surgery just this weekend who had told me they had lost life savings to the tune of a five-figure sum. Now, fraud often hurts the most vulnerable, either those on low incomes or with lower tech proficiency, who are also more likely to fall victim. More than 3/4, though, of authorised push payment fraud originates online. Now, research from Innovate Finance on a fintech illustrates the challenge posed by online purchase scams. They found that Facebook Marketplace represented a staggering 51% of all fraud cases for the firm in question. And after securing this debate, a main UK bank got in touch with me, outlining similar statistics where a huge part of the fraud they encounter originates from Facebook Marketplace. So we must get better at stopping fraud at the source. But there are some positives to consider. Tackling payment fraud could contribute £6 billion to the UK's GDP over 5 years, and that would really strengthen our economy. So, there's a smorgasbord of issues that are causing our downfall. So I want to outline 7 positive steps to begin tackling fraud and economic crime. And these come from meetings I've had with trade bodies, consumer groups, banks and payment providers, and also many industry reports. We can become a world leader in anti-fraud and economic crime. And from the government, in my view, little investments are needed, but a new regulatory apparatus and new levels of coordination are needed. I stand as a firm friend to the Minister and the government in making that change happen. So, if you'll allow me, I will outline some positive suggestions to tackle fraud. Recommendation 1. The new government should set an anti-fraud target. In June 2023, the previous government published its fraud strategy, saying it would cut fraud by 10% on 2019 levels by December 2024. It achieved this, but the target was not ambitious enough and, importantly, excluded businesses. So the government should commit to a fraud target that is genuinely ambitious and do so in collaboration with business. I don't want to pick an arbitrary number because it's about focusing on action rather than aims. So one option could be to set a fraud target that we should have a lower fraud rate per capita than international peers. For example, an ambitious target that the per capita rate of fraud should be lower in the UK in 5 years' time than, say, France, Germany and others. Recommendation 2, the creation of a new national anti-fraud centre. I believe we need a new, strong centre for anti-fraud to face the complex interdisciplinary challenges that fraud poses. Let me turn to action fraud. It has skilled individuals, but regrettably, it is no longer fit for purpose in my view. It's often the view of industry as well. We need to reform it as an organisation, and that means a review of its shortfalls, as well as the ways in which we can build on some of its successes in receiving reports. Now, during my career, I came across a case where a UK business was scammed out of over £200,000. It submitted dozens of pages of detail to Action Fraud and didn't even get a call back from the police. So in my view, we should look to Australia and create a national anti-fraud centre to drive forward the government's fraud strategy with a clear vision and clear accountability. It could be part of the Serious Fraud Office or National Crime Agency or an entity of its own, but with its own ability to potentially bring charges. The Australian Labor government launched a cutting-edge National Anti-Scam Centre in 2023. This rightly recognised the scale of the challenge and it took on directly. The first action was to tackle investment scams, followed by disrupting criminal gangs operating who were advertising non-existent jobs. So in my view, it's time to refresh the ecosystem to fight fraud for the decades to come, with a strong new National Anti-Fraud Centre at the very heart of government. And that will be about joining up the SFO, FCA, Action Fraud, NCA, Met Police, NFIB, local police forces. And it would do that with a central leadership. Because in my view, our institutions are too fragmented at present to properly deal with fraud. Recommendation 3. We should have a new national anti-fraud champion in Parliament. Following on from their previous government's appointment of an anti-fraud champion in Parliament, I encourage this government to replicate this. This would ensure better coordination across government departments and be a precursor to a potential new national anti-fraud centre. Recommendation 4. Supporting data sharing between sectors. In my view, we've got to create a framework to enable data sharing between social media companies and payment participants. If information can be shared between the two, we've got an opportunity to stop transactions at the source. Now, due to things like GDPR, there's no clear mechanism for data collaboration. But if we can find a way to create a precedent, it would give regulatory certainty. Recommendation 5. A new framework requiring banks to share payments data. If we are to make some progress, we need to find a way for banks to work collaboratively around payments data sharing. Now, I regularly meet banks and industry leaders who are receptive to this. I will give way.
Thank you. I declare an interest as well. Prior to entering Parliament, I worked at Pay.UK, the payment system operator for the UK. I thank the Honourable Member for securing this important debate and for giving way. He raises an important point, not just about the cost of fraud, both to people and businesses, but also about the importance of data sharing across banks. Does he share my view that with a new modernised payment system, we might be able to collect, more data, which could then be utilised by those across the industry to identify and tackle and prevent fraud at the source, saving businesses and customers lots of money in the future?
Thank you to the honourable gentleman. It's brilliant to have members like him with his experience from Pay.UK in this place, and I completely agree that the renewal of the new payments architecture, if we could do things like risk analysis and AI monitoring at the heart of that, we could detect payments fraud at the very centre, which would save banks billions of pounds potentially in compensation and be a better result to consumers. And indeed, industry innovations such as Money Mule Insights prove that with the later data analytics, criminals can be targeted in a much more sophisticated fashion via data sharing between payment providers. Now, Lloyds Bank got in touch with me this week to highlight that their mule hunting team identified a 44% increase in money mules over the past year, and data sharing between banks is critical in targeting money mules. Banks, for example, at present file suspicious activity reports, but they don't often or are not able to share suspicious payments transaction data with each other. If they did, there would be an opportunity to harness suspicious payments data to detect and block fraudulent and criminal transactions in real time. And I now believe we've got an unmatched opportunity to rebuild fraud and economic crime analysis with the renewal of faster payments and a new payments architecture. So in conclusion on this recommendation, much greater payments data sharing is crucial if we want to stop fraudulent transactions from being processed. Recommendation 6, the obligations on social media companies. The government could introduce a shared responsibility and liability for social media and telecommunications firms to tackle fraud origination and incentivise them to invest to prevent fraud. A new anti-fraud centre could govern regulatory powers over social media companies, and it could impose penalties or issue guidance to reduce fraud. And this would tackle things like we heard earlier, such as fraud originating from Facebook Marketplace. And may I turn to my final recommendation, number 7, which is to expand the Financial Conduct Authority's powers over the Post Office. The Post Office is the biggest cash provider in the country through its everyday banking service. It has always played an integral role in providing access to cash for the nation. That should continue. And as banks close their branches, the importance of the Post Office is growing. But following the Horizon scandal, the Post Office's reputation has been damaged. The Horizon system is still fundamentally being used today for the everyday banking system, the everyday banking service, which processes billions of cash deposits and withdrawal each and every month. So, to give banks and consumers confidence in the Post Office, it's my view that the FCA should gain direct regulatory oversight of the everyday banking service. This is critical for resilience and for managing financial crime risks. So I can confirm that I'm in the process of writing to the FCA's CEO to encourage them to provide an update on their work on money laundering via the Post Office. So in conclusion, those are 7 recommendations I'd like to implement, and I think they'd have a huge impact on our ability to better target fraud and economic crime. I will write to the government outlining these 7 recommendations, which are the culmination of meetings across industry, and I stand willing to work closely with the government on implementing them, should they be interested in doing so. I really look forward to hearing from colleagues across the House at this debate, and I look forward to working constructively with government and other members in tackling fraud, because it is so crucial we do that for financial credibility, for our constituents and for our country. Thank you, Chair.
Can I thank the honourable member for his assistance? I expect to take the first opposition spokesperson at 5:08, and they have 5 minutes each. The Minister will have 10 minutes. And if you wish to speak to Bob. So the question is that this House has considered the impact of financial fraud and economic crime. David Burton-Sampson.
Thank you, Ms Vaz, and I welcome the Minister too to his place. And I congratulate my honourable friend from York Outer for securing this massively important debate, a subject which I have been more than aware of throughout my entire professional career. And in that light, I also declare an interest that I have been working in the financial services industry for many years. The level of fraud in the UK directly affecting consumers in 2023 was estimated to be a staggering £8 billion, according to the UK Fraud Cost Measures Committee. The former Conservative government did not prioritise economic crime sufficiently, according to the Treasury Select Committee. Now it's up to the new government to take action to improve the supervisory system and combat economic crime, which is growing. Improvements need to be made to assess the extent of economic crime and fraud in the UK. And it's telling that there are actually no clear measures of the true impact of fraud on individuals, businesses and the economy. And some of the suggestions that my right honourable friend has just brought up will help in getting to that real understanding of the impact. There are a wide range of crimes which fall under fraud and economic crime category, ranging from smaller sums of money being involved to huge sums. Only last month, and to give a real personal example, in my constituency in Southend, some of my constituents were left feeling tricked over, believe it or not, an inflatable fun day. They had bought tickets in good faith, but it was a fictitious event. Some parents were left out of pocket after buying a number of the £15 tickets online, and clearly children were left very upset. These sorts of things just shouldn't happen, but that's one small example of how fraud can impact families on a day-to-day basis. In my county of Essex, the county's police force have a serious economic crime unit which seized £2 million worth of assets and made 15 arrests in the month of February alone after an intensive month-long investigation. This squad investigates offences which include romance scams, online marketplace scams, rogue traders, investment fraud, bribery and corruption. As my right honourable friend mentioned, fraud can have a devastating impact on individuals and their families, not only on their finances, but on their well-being, leaving people feeling manipulated and deceived. There is, of course, the long-term impact on their finances, and that has a knock-on longer-term impact on the economy, where they no longer have their hard-earned savings to spend on much-needed goods and services, or just on enjoying themselves. My background before coming to this place, as I mentioned, was in financial services, and most recently in mortgages. And with your indulgence, Ms Vaz, I want to share a different type of fraud, where the consumer often unwittingly targets the lender, not usually out of malice, but with the desire of achieving their housing dream, which for many can often be seen as beyond their reach due to loan-to-income restrictions and high deposit requirements. Mortgage fraud can include overvaluing properties, overstating a salary or income, concealing a second mortgage from the primary lender, or misstating the use of a property to either benefit from a more preferential rate of interest or to borrow more than the lender assesses that a client can afford. The UK's leading fraud prevention service, CFAS, revealed in January 2024 that 1 in 6, that's 16% of UK adults, have admitted that they or somebody they knew had misled mortgage companies about their annual salary in order to buy their home. I agree with CFAS saying more needs to be done to raise awareness of just how serious a crime mortgage fraud can be. Not being honest about your income, your debt history, your employment, or the value of your property is a serious matter, and being caught will have long-term effects on your ability to gain a mortgage and could have other financial consequences. In summary, Ms Vaz, I call upon the Minister and the new government to work with the relevant partners and stakeholders to strengthen and expand the fraud strategy which was announced in May 2023 to combat the ever-growing and more sophisticated fraudulent schemes that target individual consumers. Equally, awareness needs to be raised amongst consumers around the consequences of them falling unexpectedly into the world of fraud when applying for finance, especially mortgages. I would like to see a collaboration between banks and other lenders, the regulator and the government to drive an awareness of mortgage fraud through misrepresentation. This, of course, will be complemented by the government's plans to make the dream of home ownership more accessible for all. Thank you.
Chairship for the second time today. Can I first of all thank the Honourable Member for York Outer for setting the scene so very well. I think, Madam Chair, one of the great things about coming to debates with some of the new members is the new members bring their expertise, their knowledge and their interest in these subject matters to these debates, and I think it enriches the House greatly. and I look very much forward to other contributions from honourable members when the time comes. Very pleased to see the Minister's place. He and I have been friends a long time on the opposition side of the chamber, as we were then, and I'm pleased to see him in a place. Well-deserved honour for the Minister, and also pleased to see the Shadow Minister in his place as well. I'm pleased to speak in this debate, and I want to just quite very quickly, in the short time that we have, Madam Chair, I've heard of countless economic crime cases, including scams and frauds. Constituents must be aware of the dangers. So it's absolutely vital to give some background on that to discuss these matters. When I come, Madam Chair, I always bring an Northern Ireland perspective to it. I wish I would be able to tell the honourable gentleman that things in Northern Ireland are better, but they're not. And indeed, when you hear the figures, you'll probably be shocked at just how bad they are. Last year, according to the PSNI, £23.1 million was lost due to fraud over the last 13 months in Northern Ireland. Between December 22 and January 24, some 5,412 reports of fraud and sums ranging from £5,000 up to an almost, unfortunately, £250,000 loss. It's absolutely, I just can't comprehend how that can happen, but it happened. And they was taken by criminals from people's bank accounts. And that gives you an idea where the scams are and where we need to focus. In 2023 alone, there were 3,400 cases of economic fraud. In addition to many of these cases, frauds and scams are being committed at a distance through social media, through online websites, through phone calls, through text messages. I'm probably going to age myself now by saying this, but Madam Chair, I remember getting this message from a general in Nigeria. My goodness. Yeah. Well, right away, your hackles were up. Certainly, I don't know any generals in Nigeria. And whenever they tell me I've won $100,000 or whatever it was, I knew I couldn't have, because I didn't enter any competition. I didn't have any friends out there, no relatives there. Therefore, it was a scam, quite clearly. But if I sent them my bank details, they would forward this astronomically large amount of money to me. But the thing I'm making is, if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably isn't true. And that's the point I'm making. So if somebody comes along and tells you that you've won this amount of money, just send me through your bank details and we'll transfer the money to you. I'm not smarter than anybody else, Madam Chair. I don't profess to be, or I am. But whenever somebody comes along with something that's just that good, it's not good, and beware. I want to give an example of a woman who come to see me, an elderly lady, and I want to speak for the elderly and the vulnerable, and that's going to be my focus for the short time I have. I dealt with an issue in my office just last week where a lady clicked a link on Facebook to lodge money into an online pot to gain interest over a period of time, to which her details were taken and the £276 immediately taken from her account. The dangers of social media are broad enough, and online fraud and scamming just seems to be at its peak currently, and I see that regularly, unfortunately, in my office. We advise her immediately to put a block on her card, contact the local PSNI to make a report, but she is only one example, unfortunately, of what so many people are facing on a daily basis every week in my constituency. I was just looking up there the case for, I hope I can get this now, there it is. The Danske Bank that I belong to, they send you these things regularly, but just perhaps maybe a wee warning and a caution to those. It says here, we want to remind you that we're all at risk of fraud, even if you're scam savvy. Bank impersonation scams are on the rise, what the gentleman has referred to. But remember, we'll never call you to ask for log-on details, PIN numbers or passcodes, including those we send by text. That's what my bank does to me every month or every 6 weeks. And if banks did that as a reminder to people, just to keep it fresh in their minds, I think that would be something that would be very, very helpful. The UK Economic Crime Team is responsible for leading the industry's fight against economic crime, but more needs to be done to support those who are not perhaps tech savvy. And I'm not tech savvy, by the way, I profess that. I don't understand the dangers sometimes that are out there. The Online Steering Group have numerous aims in terms of tackling economic crime, including making the UK look like the least attractive place to commit these crimes, but they're happening with a regularity that tells us that that's not the case. Whether this is internally within the UK or internationally where foreign actors are interfering, we need to ensure our constituents are protected and, most importantly, aware. The PSNI back home in Northern Ireland have a system, like a crime prevention officer, where they send out to elderly people specifically, and those who are vulnerable specifically, and to groups where elderly people maybe meet every week. They will go down and talk to them and give them some information. I would suggest, Minister, maybe that's something that maybe could be done with a greater regularity to remind people. And people do need to be reminded on a regular basis. I finish with this, Madam Chair, because I'm conscious others want to speak. In terms of money laundering, and we've seen some of those terrible examples in Northern Ireland, where I have to say, to be fair, the PSNI, in conjunction with other police forces across the United Kingdom and further afield, have been able to get on top of that. But they're still happening. There's scams happening and there's fraud. There is more work to be done. And I look very much to the Minister with great respect. I know the Minister will come back with the answers that perhaps will encourage us and give us some hope for some guidance on his updated plans to make our economic system run smoothly, because it has to, but also to ensure that across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, we have good structure on how to deal with these issues and the means to do so when it comes to that as well. Madam Chair, thank you.
Serena Breckenridge.
Thank you, Chair. I'd also like to commend my honourable friend for securing this important debate and for shining a light on an issue that has been neglected for far too long. One of the growing concerns facing my constituents in Wolverhampton North East is the rise of fraud, particularly scams perpetrated from overseas. We often hear calls for more arrests and prosecutions of these criminals, and I fully support that. However, we also need to acknowledge that a significant and increasing number of these fraudsters are not operating from within the UK. Instead, they're part of international fraud rings based in hotspots like India, the Philippines, South Africa, Brazil, and parts of Eastern Europe. With advanced technology, we have machines capable of making thousands of calls or sending thousands of texts per minute. These criminals can easily target people here in Britain. Our country, unfortunately, is a prime target for such activity. We do much of our shopping and banking online, and the widespread use of the English language makes it clear and easier for fraudsters abroad to deceive and manipulate their victims here. The real question is, what do we do about this? And I suggest that when we negotiate trade deals with countries where this kind of criminal activity is prominent, we push for stronger cooperation in fighting fraud. Let's make fraud prevention part of those agreements, giving those countries a real incentive to work with us to tackle this issue. Without such action, fraud will continue to grow, impacting more and more families in places like Wolverhampton North East. It's time we take strong, global, coordinated action to protect our residents from the scourge of international fraud. Thank you.
Yeah.
Spokesperson for the Lib Dems, Chris Coughlin.
And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and what a brilliant and necessary debate. And I commend the honourable member for York Outer both for this debate on financial fraud and economic crime and for your professional expertise in this area. I should also declare an interest. I spent 11 years working in financial services and separately worked in the Foreign Office on counter-terrorism, so I know how vital this debate is. The honourable member for York Outer made a really interesting point around your 7 proposals, particularly around the link between tackling fraud and economic growth, and especially your call for a national anti-fraud centre based on the Australian model. The Liberal Democrats called for an online crime agency in our manifesto, so this is something we would be interested in supporting. We need a dedicated body to effectively tackle online crimes, such as personal fraud, and our police forces are overwhelmed. Local forces lack the specialist skills required to combat the complexity of modern online crime. And while the National Crime Agency focuses on the most serious offences, we need an agency specifically equipped to deal with online fraud.
Jim Shannon.
Can I commend the honourable gentleman for the reference to the NCA, the National Crime Agency? Just last week in Northern Ireland, I understand, Madam Chair, they took out their first unexplained wealth order in Northern Ireland against a man suspected of involvement in serious organised crime. If anyone is living above their means, it should be an example of where the money is coming from. Does he feel that perhaps maybe there needs to be more emphasis on that as well?
Chris Coughlin.
Thank you for the honourable member for intervening. I agree with you in terms of there should be more emphasis on that area as well. And I also thought the honourable member for York Outer made a really interesting point around the lack of FCA regulation of the post office, which to me, I would agree, that does appear to be a gap in our existing regulatory framework. The honourable member for Southend, Lee and West gave some really moving personal accounts about the cost of these online scams, and we also are calling for the naming and shaming of banks. Those with the worst records on preventing fraud and reimbursing victims, they should be held accountable. Financial institutions have a duty to protect their customers, and we need to call them out when they don't. The honourable member for Strangford brought out the power of social media scams, and so we're also calling for a public awareness campaign. We need to empower everyone to spot, to avoid and report fraud and scams. But let me be clear, the onus should not be on the individuals to prevent fraud. Victims should never be blamed for falling prey to sophisticated scams. This is about building a society that protects its citizens, not one that burdens them with responsibilities that should lie with institutions. As we've heard, the numbers for this are staggering in terms of the billions that have been lost to fraud and just the amount of sheer volume of crime that is now online. Despite these facts, the previous government's response has been lacklustre, and I was moved by the honourable member's point that 40% of the cost of crime is fraud, yet only 1% of police resources are dedicated to online fraud. And of course, Ms Vaz will remember that the previous government took this area with such little seriousness that they did not include fraud in crime statistics. So will the Minister commit to including fraud in crime statistics to demonstrate the government's seriousness on this issue? The government must also recognise that economic crime poses a significant threat to our democracy. For too long, the previous government allowed oligarchs to treat the UK as their personal playground, funneling dirty money into our economy and undermining our values. Liberal Democrats are calling on the government to begin seizing frozen Russian assets and to use the proceeds to support Ukraine, to close loopholes in economic crime legislation, which allow associates of authoritarian regimes such as Putin's cronies to funnel corrupt funds into our country, and to properly resource the National Crime Agency to ensure it has the tools to tackle complex financial crimes. We're also calling for an audit of UK-based assets owned by officials from countries with troubling human rights records, such as China and Iran, to ensure we're not enabling regimes that abuse their own citizens. As a former counter-terrorism officer, I know how important cross-border cooperation is, and the honourable member for Wolverhampton North and East really brought this out in your points around people conducting these scams are not necessarily in the same geographic location. I also know the damage that Brexit caused to our cross-border cooperation on serious and online crime. So will the Minister commit to improving cooperation with our European allies and more widely on financial fraud and economic crime? I look forward to the Minister's response, and Ms Vaz, it was a pleasure again to serve with you in this debate, and thank you to the Honourable Member for York Outer for bringing it.
Minister, who was appointed this morning? Paul Holmes.
Thank you very much, much, Ms Vaz, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to be able to respond to this debate on behalf of the opposition as a newly appointed Shadow Home Office Minister as of this morning. And I'd like to congratulate the honourable member for York Outer on securing this debate and the chance to discuss the serious issues that we heard from him earlier. And also, can I put on record my condolences to his constituent that he mentioned at his surgery last week for the serious issues that she's faced. And can I thank the honourable member for Strangford in, as usual, showing his knowledge about yet another subject. Many of us will know someone who has, or ourselves have been, the victim of financial fraud. And the honourable gentleman, the member for Southend West, outlined the various possibilities that people can be targeted by, from a pensioner who is tricked into giving their savings due to a rogue cold call, or an unsuspecting parent receiving a scam text purportedly from their child asking for money. All ages and all sections of society are at risk. And as these criminal schemes become more and more sophisticated, nobody is immune. And we have seen that bank accounts can be emptied in minutes and life savings lost. And in 2021, victims reported losing £2.35 billion to fraudsters and scammers. But we also know from these statistics that it is elderly and vulnerable people who are most susceptible to scams and fraud. To the vile criminals who target them, they are seen as a means to enrichment and to profit from their misery. It's our duty to protect them. In an astonishing statistic, Home Office figures indicate that social and economic cost to the UK from economic crime is £8.4 billion per year, and these costs directly impact the lives and livelihoods of millions of citizens and further exacerbate social and economic pressures. And I look forward to hearing from the Minister his reassurances and how he will continue, and let me welcome him to his role, but how he will continue to make the progress that was delivered by the last government going forward. But we also know, as the Honourable Gentleman for York Outer mentioned, that it's not just individuals who are targeted by this. In a time of increasing global instability, adversaries are constantly probing for weaknesses in our digital financial infrastructure, from cyber attacks aimed at crippling software to ransomware attempts to extort money. Our systems are constantly having to update and evolve to keep ahead in a technological arms race. I was interested to hear recommendation number 1 in the Honourable Gentleman's speech that he outlined this afternoon. And I wondered whether I could just press the Minister on hearing whether he will look at that proposal seriously, which would get support from the opposition as he goes forward in his outline of his proposals going forward. The last government did show leadership in this area, and it was the government that introduced a reporting mechanism which was bolstered by replacing action fraud with a state-of-the-art system for victims to report fraud, while a new national fraud squad with over 400 new specialist investigators and to make fraud a priority for the police. But I would like to know whether the Minister would look seriously at the proposal outlined by the Honourable Gentleman, the member for York Outer, for a new national fraud centre. I think that's an interesting proposal, and I'd like to hear whether the government would look at that. And an anti-fraud czar here in this place where members can go to and can be a champion. I know the Minister is a champion. He has many responsibilities. We could never go without another champion going forward in this Parliament. Because if we do take a new approach, we can make a great deal of progress on the 13% reduction in fraud that we saw under the last government, and we can go further. And the need to tackle this growing threat is clear. We, under the economic crime plan brought forward by the previous government, in which for the first time introduced a more effective and joint way of working across various organisations, including law enforcement, supervisory agencies and the private sector, through the landmark Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. Greater tools were put in place to help our ability to fight that economic crime. And of course, we're all alive to the threats affecting our national security, with our economy being a prime target for rogue forces, strengthening our defences when it comes to freezing assets. And abuses of our open economy were key drivers after Russia invaded Ukraine. And we must continue to strengthen our economic defence in the wake of rogue foreign entities. We have seen, finally, Ms Vaz, we have seen the new government make lofty statements about their desire to get tough on fraud with a new expanded fraud strategy, and I welcome that. But given recent policy decisions made by this government, going against promises and commitments which were made during the general election in other areas, I hope that this is not an area where we will let vulnerable people down, and I hope that this government does deliver on those promises. We all agree the need to tackle this issue. It's only to be hoped that this government is as committed and passionate about dealing with this issue as the last one, so that we can make progress together going forward, and he will have the opposition support in tackling this issue. Thank you.
Minister Dan Giles.
Thank you very much. Well, can I say it's a particular pleasure to serve under your chairship, Madam Chair, and can I begin by congratulating the Honourable Member for York Outer for securing this debate on what is, and there's been a clear consensus about this, a very important matter. I often find myself in agreement with the Honourable Member for Strangford, perhaps even too regularly do I find myself in agreement with him, but I completely agreed with what he said about the expertise that we have seen amongst new members, and I think we've seen that very clearly today, not least from the Honourable Member, because what came through loud and clear from his speech is that he has a very strong knowledge and a very comprehensive understanding of these issues. And I think collectively we owe him a debt of gratitude for bringing them to our attention this afternoon. I'm also grateful to all of those other honourable members who've contributed to what I think has genuinely been a very sensible and constructive debate. I'm also very grateful genuinely to both of the Shadow Ministers for the very sensible contributions that they have made. I want to welcome my honourable friend, the Shadow Minister speaking for the Lib Dems. He comes to this place with a lot of hugely relevant and credible experience, and I look forward to working closely with him. He made a specific point, a challenge, an entirely reasonable challenge, about the importance of seeking to work closely with allies in Europe. I can absolutely give him that assurance. We understand the importance of doing so, and we are on the case with doing that. I also want to welcome the Shadow Immigration Minister to his post. I, on behalf of the department, can genuinely say that we wish him well and we look forward to working closely with him. I've had quite a busy day, but I'm sure he's had quite a busy day as well preparing for this debate. And he made, as he always does, he made a number of very sensible and reasonable points. And I'm happy to confirm to him the commitment and the priority that we attach to these important matters. And I hope very much that we can work closely together as we move forward. Now, I think, Madam Chair, based on the contributions that we've had from the debate today, there is a very clear consensus that economic crime and fraud are pernicious threats that ruin lives and damage our prosperity. They must be dealt with as a priority, and I want to take the opportunity today to say something about the government's approach as I seek to respond to the many excellent points that honourable members have raised throughout the course of this debate. Now, economic crime threatens our national security and the prosperity of the UK. It covers a broad range of illicit activity, including fraud, money laundering, kleptocracy and corruption. It drives serious organised crime, which has a hugely damaging and corrosive impact and causes immense harm to the public, to all of our constituents. It affects the financial and emotional well-being of victims and the interests of legitimate businesses, and it undermines our international reputation. Now, fraud against individuals accounts for 36% of crime. That's according to the Crime Survey for England and Wales for the year ending March 2024. So it is by far the most common offence. These are startling statistics that underline the scale of the threat and the challenge. But what they do not do is capture the full horror of the misery and the devastation that lies behind the numbers. The stories of life savings snatched, of confidence shattered, of emotional distress. And we know that nobody is safe from fraud. It can affect anyone, with 1 in 18 people becoming a victim of fraud in the year ending March 24. Businesses are also under threat. Now, the Economic Crime Survey for 2020 estimated that 1 in 5 in the sectors that they surveyed had been a victim of fraud in the previous 3 years. These figures are another striking illustration of the scale of the threat and underline why it is so crucial that we eliminate any safe spaces for criminals to operate in. Now, I should note that the crime survey shows that fraud is down 10% on the previous year, which is encouraging. And I want to thank all of those working across government, industry and law enforcement who work to turn the screw on fraudsters and criminals. We owe them a huge debt of gratitude for their important work, and a lot of effort has gone into addressing these issues, and that is to be welcomed. But to address the entirely reasonable point made by the Honourable Member for Southend West and Lee, we must now go further. And we know from experience that fraudsters are well organised. They are also opportunists and will try and perpetrate their crimes on anyone they can, including the most vulnerable within our society, which is, of course, especially callous. Now, given that we are up against devious and resourceful criminals, we need to ensure that our approach is fit for purpose. Now, my honourable friend clearly has a very strong command of the subject matter, which he has translated into a number of insightful recommendations. And the Shadow Minister rightly pressed me to ensure that we are going to take those seriously. Now, I hope the honourable member will understand if I stop short on this particular occasion of making policy commitments at this stage and in this forum. That being said, his suggestions, his 7 recommendations, and the Internal Mail are clearly working in overdrive because the letter dropped just as he mentioned the 7 recommendations, have clearly been very well thought through and are backed up by his considerable expertise. And I can give him the assurance that I absolutely will take them away and come back to him with a response as we work to continue to shape this government's approach. Just as an incidental comment, I was particularly intrigued by suggestion number 3 around the establishment of an anti-fraud champion. I did wonder whether the honourable member had anyone in mind, but we can leave that one hanging there for now. Anyway, Madam Chair, underlying any specific steps that the government takes, we will be steadfast in our determination to combat economic crime wherever and however it manifests itself. We are committed to working with key partners across the public sector, the private sector and law enforcement to reduce fraud and better protect public and businesses. Estimates suggest that around 80% of fraud has an online element, much of which originates from overseas, which was a point very well made by the honourable member for Wolverhampton North East. And we know that online platforms, as well as telecommunication services, are being exploited by fraudsters to commit their crimes. So it's vital that we pull together with industry, regulators and consumer groups to consider what else can be done to close the gaps that criminals exploit. The Sector Charter programme works to complement legislation and move in a more agile and targeted manner and has improved collaboration with industry. It has enabled effective changes within sectors such as telecommunications, retail banking, tech and accountancy. And we've seen telecommunications companies install spam shields which have blocked over 1 billion text messages. In the tech sector, and I know the honourable gentleman knows a lot about this, changes to make sure people are who they are, who they say they are, by the introduction of verification measures of marketplace sellers and advertisers. And whilst we've seen strong action from companies, including via the sector charters, it is important that we see counter-fraud activity prioritised. Recent legislation, such as the Online Safety Act, will help raise standards and best practice, but we remain open to the use of further legislation and regulation in the future, and that is a continuing conversation we will want to have with the honourable gentleman and with members right across the House. Madam Chair, there is still plenty more for government and industry to do together, and I look forward to collaborating with our key partners in the coming months. We must also increase the disruption and prosecution of fraudsters. A national fraud squad of 400 new posts, led by the NCA's National Economic Crime Centre and the City of London Police, will target the most harmful fraudsters. This will transform the law enforcement response by taking a much more proactive and intelligence-led approach to disrupting the most serious fraudsters, both domestically and overseas. Another important element is public awareness. We need to make sure that people are alert to these crimes, and it is essential that we have the tools to protect people so that they have the confidence and trust to come forward and report cases where they have fallen victim to fraud. That is why we're working with the City of London Police to create a new Police Fraud Protect network, which will engage with local forces to provide consistent messaging and safeguarding advice to local communities. And it is why there is a wealth of advice on how to spot and avoid fraud on our Stop Think Fraud campaign website, though I note my honourable friend's comments about this. As well as protecting individuals, government is also, of course, committed to protecting businesses from fraud and other related crime, such as ransomware. The Home Office supports a network of regional cyber resilience centres to provide cyber security advice and guidance to businesses across England and Wales. We are also committed to improving economic crime legislation. The economic crime measures in last session's Criminal Justice Bill did not make the statute book before the general election was called. So since the election, the government has been examining how best to progress action in a number of areas, including the reform of the criminal confiscation regime, the banning of SIM farms that can be used in fraudulent activity, accessing money in suspended accounts to further tackle economic crime, and improving corporate liability laws. We understand that these are important reforms to cut crime, but also understand that there will be others. We will set out our position in due course and, where necessary, introduce further legislation. Madam Chair, in closing, let me thank all honourable members attending today for the contributions that they have made. And once again, let me thank and congratulate the honourable member for securing this debate. We've covered, I think, a good deal of ground, all of it constructive and helpful. For all the statistics and policies and measures, it is the victims that we must always keep at the forefront of our minds. We must prevent more people and businesses suffering as a result of economic crime and fraud, and we have to protect our society and our economy from these threats. As I've set out, this government is committed to doing just that, and I look forward to working with colleagues across the House in this critical endeavour. Thank you.
Mr. Luke Charters to Wycombe.
Thank you, Ms Vaz, for chairing today. And I'm delighted this House is being able to consider today's motion. It is a matter of real importance, and that's one that's very clear the government will take seriously. I'm grateful to the Minister for attending the debate, and both the Shadow Minister and Lib Dem frontbencher for engaging too. I'm also grateful to the Minister for considering my 7 recommendations. And to all of you who contribute, it's clear there are some powerful advocates for your constituents, many of you who have experienced constituents coming to surgeries and sharing their harrowing stories of being scammed. And I hope to work with some of you on these issues over the months and years ahead. I outlined in my maiden speech that under this government there should be no safe harbour for fraudsters, no compromise in our pursuit of their schemes, and, importantly, no escape from justice. But more than that, I'm encouraged by the Minister's words, and I know that this government is taking fraud seriously. So by the end of this Parliament, I really hope we can look back and know that we have made huge steps forward, and I believe we can become a world leader in tackling this once and for all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Can I thank the audio technician for sorting the problem out earlier? The question is that this House has considered the impact of financial fraud and economic crime. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order.